Our neighbor tried to take our house, but karma hit back. She was billed $250K, but she did this to us. Before diving into the details of this wild story, let me introduce the key players. First, there's Nancy, our entitled neighbor, who seemed to think the world revolved around her whims. Then there's her equally spoiled and reckless son, Sam. Lastly, there's Tom, the previous owner of our house, whose involvement, while brief, set the stage for everything that followed. This tale spans nearly 14 years, from the day we bought our home to the day karma finally came knocking on Nancy's door. Significant time gaps separate many of the events, so bear that in mind as we unravel this saga. Let's start at the beginning. Nancy owned a sprawling piece of land on the outskirts of a popular recreational lake. Her property wasn't exactly prime waterfront, but it was situated along the only road leading to some of the lake's most desirable properties, including high-end resorts and bustling boat docks. Some of the homes along this route were affordable for ordinary families, but others drew the attention of wealthier buyers. This location and Nancy's greed would play a crucial role later. Years ago, Nancy, who was quite affluent, decided to divide her large property into 4 parcels. She gifted 2 of them to her adult children, one to her daughter, who surprisingly turned out to be a decent person, and one to her son, Sam, who was the complete opposite. Nancy built homes on both parcels to suit her children's preferences. The 3rd parcel held Nancy's own home, and the 4th was used to build a convenience store, presumably to capitalize on the traffic heading toward the lake. Nancy handed over the property deeds to her children, which predictably set the stage for disaster. Her daughter managed her new home responsibly and didn't cause any trouble. Sam, on the other hand, was a walking tornado of bad decisions. He was infamous in the neighborhood for hosting loud, disruptive parties that raged well into the night. The police were called so often that it seemed they had a permanent post near his house. Despite all this, Nancy enabled his behavior, covering all his bills and utilities while turning a blind eye to his antics. There was just one exception: the property taxes, which were in Sam's name. Sam, being the irresponsible partier that he was, never bothered to pay his property taxes. Whether Nancy assumed he was handling it or simply didn't care remains unclear, but the inevitable happened. The county seized the property, and Sam's house went up for auction. By this point, the home was in shambles. Holes in the walls, a massive gap in the living room floor that opened to the garage basement, and floors so damaged they were deemed unsalvageable. The bank labeled the house uninhabitable, and only cash buyers were allowed to bid. Enter Tom, a retired house flipper. Tom wasn't one of those flashy TV personalities with deep pockets. He was a humble, hard-working man who flipped homes as a way to stay active and engaged. He bought properties like Sam's at rock-bottom prices, renovated them himself, and sold them for a modest profit. By the time we met him, Tom had already put considerable work into the house and had plans to sell it once the renovations were complete. We discovered the house by chance while browsing real estate listings. It seemed perfect, just the right size, a charming neighborhood, and close to the lake where we loved to fish and boat. When we drove by, we spotted Tom hard at work and decided to stop and introduce ourselves. He was kind and down-to-earth, happy to chat with us about the property. When we asked about the price, he admitted he hadn't finalized the listing yet, but was open to offers. We expressed our interest but didn't press too hard, as Tom mentioned he had other potential buyers. A couple of weeks later, we got an unexpected call from him. Tom explained that his sister had fallen ill and he needed to leave town to care for her. He didn't have the time to finish the renovations and offered to sell the house to us as is for a fair price. We jumped at the opportunity. With the help of a realtor friend, we secured a loan and agreed to bring the house up to code within 2 weeks, as required by the bank. Tom couldn't continue working on the house himself, but he provided detailed instructions on what needed to be done. Thanks to his meticulous planning and the surplus from our loan, we were able to complete the necessary repairs on time with the help of some amazing friends. After months of hard work, replacing floors, rewiring, patching walls, and scraping off decades-old wallpaper, we finally turned the rundown property into a home we could be proud of. Just as we were settling in, Nancy made her grand entrance. She came over to introduce herself with a warm smile and a homemade pie. At first, she seemed kind, and we couldn't understand why Tom had warned us about her. But as the conversation drew to a close, Nancy's tone shifted. With a calculated air of compassion, she informed us that our house actually belonged to her. According to Nancy, Tom had no right to sell it, and we had been scammed. She claimed we had 30 days to vacate the premises. The shock was overwhelming. The thought of losing our dream home after pouring so much time, effort, and money into it was devastating. We thanked Nancy for letting us know and promised to investigate. The first thing we did was contact the bank, who quickly confirmed that Tom was the rightful owner of the deed. Nancy's claims were baseless. We weren't content to rely solely on the bank's reassurance, so we took additional steps to ensure the legality of our purchase. Our realtor, who had worked closely with Tom during the sale, corroborated everything the bank told us. She confirmed that Tom was the rightful owner when we purchased the house and assured us that our name was now correctly listed on the deed. To further solidify our understanding, we contacted courthouse officials who, without hesitation, verified our ownership of the property. Every source we consulted gave the same answer. The house was ours, and Nancy's claims were baseless. As we unraveled the story, we also learned more about Nancy's son, Sam. The neighbors painted a vivid picture of him as the neighborhood's reckless party enthusiast, infamous for his late-night rages and complete disregard for property upkeep. His negligence was well known, and the neighbors described how his constant partying had left the house in shambles by the time it went up for auction. His refusal to pay property taxes over the years had led to the house being seized by the county and eventually auctioned off. This backstory shed light on Nancy's desperation. She wasn't just trying to reclaim a family home. She was attempting to erase the consequences of her son's irresponsibility. A few days after her initial visit, Nancy returned, but this time her tone was more confrontational. She asked bluntly when we planned to move out, as though she were merely waiting for us to hand over the keys. We calmly explained that we had legally purchased the property, that Tom had been the rightful owner, and that there was no scam or foul play involved. While we expressed sympathy for the emotional loss of the property, we firmly stated that we couldn't simply relinquish our home after all the time, effort, and money we had invested into it. Nancy wasn't deterred. Her expression softened as she began recounting her family's connection to the land. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described decades of cherished memories. Family barbecues, birthdays, holiday gatherings, all tied to this house. She spoke of how the property had been in her family for generations and how losing it felt like losing a piece of her family's legacy. While her words were heartfelt, it was hard to ignore the glaring omissions. Nancy glossed over the fact that Sam's negligence had caused the loss and refused to acknowledge her role in enabling his behavior. When we asked why her family hadn't bid on the house at the auction, especially since it had sold for just $70,000, Nancy's response was baffling. She claimed that paying for the house would have been beneath her family, as they believed the property was rightfully theirs and shouldn't have been up for sale in the first place. Her indignation left us speechless. We reiterated that we couldn't simply hand over the house, especially given the additional $40,000 we had spent on renovations. In an effort to find a compromise, we offered to sell Nancy the house for $130,000. This was more than fair, given the home's improved condition and proximity to the lake, and it was still well below market value. We even suggested financing options that could help her manage the purchase, hoping she'd see the offer as a reasonable resolution. Instead of gratitude, Nancy seemed taken aback. She had clearly expected us to either leave or sell the house for next to nothing. She left to consider the offer, but it was evident she wasn't happy. A week later, Nancy returned with a counteroffer, one so low it felt insulting. She offered $20,000, claiming that she shouldn't have to pay anything for a house she believed still belonged to her family. When we explained that her offer was far too low, she begrudgingly raised it to $25,000, condescendingly acknowledging the effort we'd put into renovations. Her dismissive attitude, combined with her refusal to recognize the true value of the house, was infuriating. She accused us of being liars and thieves, insisting the house wasn't worth what we claimed. Her blatant disrespect for the work we'd poured into the home was the last straw. We firmly told Nancy to leave and made it clear she was no longer welcome on our property. We also informed her that the house was no longer for sale at any price, not even if she offered double its market value. Nancy stormed off in a fury, hurling insults as she went. We thought that would be the end of it, but things only escalated from there. Within days, we began hearing whispers around the neighborhood. Nancy was spreading malicious rumors, claiming we had stolen the house from her family through fraudulent means. She accused us of being swindlers and con artists, spinning a story that painted us as the villains. At first, we ignored the gossip, believing no one would take her seriously. However, the situation took a dangerous turn when a man we didn't recognize pulled into our driveway one evening, armed with a gun. The man, who we later learned was a self-proclaimed neighborhood peacekeeper, confronted us aggressively. He demanded that we vacate the house immediately, insisting we had no right to be there. From his words, it was clear he had been influenced by Nancy's lies. He was known in the area for taking matters into his own hands, especially in disputes where law enforcement wasn't readily available. While some neighbors appreciated his vigilantism in our rural community, this time his actions crossed the line. Facing this armed threat, we knew we couldn't handle the situation on our own. Over time, the dynamics in the neighborhood shifted dramatically. When we first moved in, the tension Nancy created seemed insurmountable. Her influence was a shadow that loomed over everything, keeping many of our neighbors distant. However, as time passed, people began warming up to us. Small gestures like holiday treats and friendly greetings started breaking the ice. Slowly, the stories about Nancy and her family began surfacing, and the facade she had built started to crumble. Nancy's convenience store had once been the heart of the community. Its central location and proximity made it an easy choice for quick errands or last-minute items. It wasn't known for great service or reasonable prices, but its convenience was unmatched. For years, the community had relied on it, even if it meant paying a little extra or overlooking minor issues. That loyalty began to waver as rumors of double charging, shady business practices, and Sam's poor management spread. The complaints started small, with people noticing discrepancies in their receipts. At first, they dismissed it as an innocent mistake, but as the overcharges became more frequent, suspicions grew. One day, Mrs. Jensen, an elderly neighbor, came to us visibly upset. She had noticed repeated overcharges during her shopping trips and didn't feel comfortable confronting Nancy directly. She feared retaliation, especially after seeing how Nancy treated other dissatisfied customers. Her concerns mirrored what we had experienced, confirming that the issue wasn't isolated. We encouraged Mrs. Jensen to share her story with others, and soon enough, similar accounts emerged. Nancy's refusal to address these complaints only added fuel to the fire. She either dismissed the concerns outright or accused customers of trying to undermine her family's business. Her steadfast defense of Sam, despite mounting evidence of his dishonesty, made her complicit in the community's eyes. Sam's behavior at the store was another source of frustration. It wasn't just the overcharging. There were allegations of him pocketing cash from the register, ignoring expiration dates on food, and generally being inattentive. His lack of professionalism, coupled with Nancy's unwillingness to hold him accountable, tarnished the store's reputation. As word spread, more and more neighbors chose to shop elsewhere, even if it meant driving into town. What had once been a bustling community hub grew eerily quiet. Nancy attempted to win customers back with discounts, free coffee, and community appreciation events, but it was too late. The damage was done, and the trust she had taken for granted was irreparably broken. One day, Mr. Peacekeeper showed up at our house again, this time in a much friendlier mood. Over the months, we had developed a cordial relationship, and he often stopped by for a beer and a chat about the neighborhood. He told us about his recent experience at Nancy's store, where he had caught Sam double charging him. Mr. Peacekeeper, always thorough, had counted his cash before handing it to Sam and checked his receipt carefully. When the totals didn't match, he confronted Sam, who fumbled for excuses about the register being faulty. When pressed to show the register logs, Sam refused, confirming Mr. Peacekeeper's suspicions. Mr. Peacekeeper's findings spread quickly, cementing what many already suspected. Nancy's attempts to defend Sam and dismiss the complaints only alienated her further. Her reputation, once untouchable, was now in tatters. Even those who had initially supported her began to distance themselves. The final blow came when the IRS got involved. Years of poorly kept records and questionable accounting practices had caught up with Nancy. Investigators uncovered evidence of falsified invoices and fraudulent tax filings. She had been inflating expenses to claim larger deductions, a practice that had gone unnoticed for years. The penalties were severe, a fine of over $250,000. This financial burden, combined with the declining revenue from the store, proved insurmountable. Nancy tried to keep the store afloat, but it was a losing battle. She cut costs wherever she could, including reducing staff and inventory, but it wasn't enough. The once thriving business had become a ghost town, and Nancy had no choice but to shut it down. The property was eventually sold to an out-of-town investor who transformed it into a charming cafe and bakery. The new establishment quickly became a favorite in the neighborhood, offering fresh pastries, excellent coffee, and a welcoming atmosphere. Nancy and Sam disappeared soon after. Rumors circulated about where they had gone. Some said they moved out of state to escape their legal troubles, while others believed they were staying with distant relatives. Wherever they ended up, it was clear they were no longer part of our lives or the community. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. Without Nancy's influence, the atmosphere became friendlier and more supportive. The new cafe brought people together in a way the convenience store never had, fostering a sense of community that had been missing for years. Looking back, it's almost surreal how far things escalated. What began as a simple dispute over a house turned into a saga of entitlement, deceit, and eventual vindication. Despite the challenges, we emerged stronger and more connected to our neighbors, who ultimately saw the truth for what it was. Nancy's downfall wasn't something we celebrated, but it was a stark reminder of how destructive greed and dishonesty can be. In the end, we held on to our home, strengthened our relationships within the community, and found a sense of peace we hadn't thought possible when this all began. It was a long, difficult journey, but one that left us more grateful than ever for the life we'd built and the people who stood by us. We decided to put our efforts into other means of resolving the dispute. Fighting over land was exhausting and costly, and it wasn't a fight we wanted to drag out indefinitely. The stress and frustration of dealing with Nancy were enough to make anyone lose their patience. We looked into legal options, consulting with lawyers and local officials to see if there was a way to definitively establish our property lines without resorting to a drawn-out court battle. Meanwhile, Nancy continued her antics. She seemed to think that persistence and pressure would eventually wear us down. Every few weeks, she would come by to reiterate her claim, often with her surveyor's report in hand, as if waving it in front of us would suddenly make us concede. She also ramped up her gossip campaign, spreading rumors that we were troublemakers and squatters who had no right to the land. While her claims found traction with a few residents, most of the neighborhood had grown tired of her tactics and saw through her lies. What Nancy didn't realize was that her obsession with the property was making her careless. In her zeal to undermine us, she began making bold, exaggerated statements, even in public forums like neighborhood meetings. She claimed ownership of areas far beyond what even her surveyor's report suggested, which led to other neighbors questioning her motives. One particularly vocal neighbor, Mr. Jensen, directly challenged her during a community meeting, pointing out inconsistencies in her claims and asking why. If the land was so important to her, she hadn't secured it properly when the property changed hands years ago. Nancy's response was evasive, and her credibility took a hit. This emboldened other residents who had been quietly skeptical of her behavior. Some began recounting their own negative experiences with Nancy and her family, from the overcharging at her store to Sam's destructive parties, and now the dubious property dispute. In a surprising turn of events, one of our new allies turned out to be Nancy's own daughter, Carol. Carol had long been estranged from her mother, fed up with the family drama and favoritism shown towards Sam. While she didn't have any direct interest in the property dispute, she knew enough about Nancy's history to corroborate some of our claims. Carol shared stories of her mother's manipulative tendencies and even hinted at times when Nancy had overstepped her bounds with other neighbors. Carol's willingness to speak out added significant weight to our side of the story. With her help, we were able to piece together more of Nancy's patterns of behavior, including her habit of pushing boundaries until someone pushed back. It became clear that the property dispute wasn't just about the land, it was about control. Nancy couldn't stand the idea of someone else having something she thought should belong to her family, even if it was legally and rightfully ours. Eventually, the tension reached a boiling point. Nancy escalated her efforts by attempting to put up fencing around the disputed area. She hired a crew to start construction, claiming that her surveyor's report gave her the right to do so. When we confronted her, she smugly stated that we could take it up in court if we didn't like it. That was the final straw. We immediately contacted our lawyer, who advised us to file an injunction to halt the construction. With the evidence we had gathered over the years, including testimonies from neighbors, the bank's original survey, and even photos showing the missing land markers, we had a strong case. The court granted the injunction, forcing Nancy to stop her fencing project until the matter could be resolved legally. The legal proceedings were grueling, but they ultimately worked in our favor. Nancy's surveyor was called into question, and under scrutiny, their report was found to have critical errors. Whether these errors were intentional or not, the surveyor faced fines and professional repercussions. Nancy, on the other hand, was ordered to pay for the damages caused by her attempted construction and the legal fees we had incurred defending our property. The final blow came when the court ordered a new, independent survey to settle the matter once and for all. This time, the survey confirmed what we had always known. Our property lines were exactly as they had been when we purchased the land. Nancy's claims were baseless, and the disputed area was indisputably ours. Nancy's reaction was predictably dramatic. She accused everyone, from the judge to the surveyors, of being biased against her. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The community, having seen the truth unfold over the years, was firmly on our side. Even Mr. Peacekeeper, once skeptical of our intentions, apologized for doubting us and commended us for standing our ground. In the aftermath, Nancy's reputation was in shambles. The fines and legal fees left her financially strained, and the loss of her store had already dealt a significant blow to her standing in the neighborhood. She retreated into her home, rarely seen or heard from again. Sam, true to form, moved on to greener pastures, or so we heard, leaving his mother to deal with the fallout alone. As for us, the resolution brought a sense of relief and vindication. It had been a long, exhausting journey, but we had finally reclaimed the peace we had sought when we first moved into our home. The property dispute had tested our patience, resilience, and resolve, but it also strengthened our bond with the community. In the end, we were proud to call this place home, knowing that we had fought for it and won against all odds. Nancy's antics and the storm that knocked down the infamous tree seemed like the grand finale to years of escalating drama. Yet, the aftermath stretched out longer than we could have imagined, turning her entitled grasp for power into a slow, self-inflicted downfall that reverberated throughout our neighborhood. It was like a never-ending series of ironic twists that left us shaking our heads while somehow solidifying our place within the community. The tree incident and the subsequent bill from the insurance company had been a turning point. Nancy, having tried every trick in the book to evade responsibility, was left with no choice but to pay the $250,000 bill. What struck everyone in the neighborhood as most absurd was how she had insisted for years that the disputed land was hers, only to suddenly claim it wasn't when the liability came her way. The surveyor, likely fearing the career-ending consequences of tampering with property boundaries, stuck to his original findings, cementing Nancy's responsibility for the damages. This decision sent ripples through our small town. Everyone now knew Nancy had not only lied about the property dispute, but also tried to pin her financial woes on us. Word spread fast, as it tends to in rural areas. Nancy, once thought of by some as the self-appointed matriarch of our corner of the world, became a punchline in whispered conversations and knowing glances at local gatherings. People would shake their heads and laugh, recalling how her years of schemes and slander had ultimately backfired. But the humiliation wasn't just confined to her reputation. The financial hit from the insurance bill, combined with the diminishing returns from her convenience store, began to strain her resources in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her store, once a hub of activity due to its convenient location, was now struggling. The double-charging scam that her son, Sam, had orchestrated had already eroded trust among her customers, and word of Nancy's behavior further drove people away. The few regulars who still shopped there often came out of necessity rather than loyalty, muttering under their breath about inflated prices and outdated products. Nancy's once bustling parking lot now looked empty most days, and it was clear that the store was barely hanging on. For us, life finally began to settle into something resembling peace. The property dispute that had loomed over us for years was no longer an active issue, though we hadn't forgotten about it. We considered the idea of hiring a surveyor to formally reclaim the land, but decided it wasn't worth the expense. Nancy's grip on the neighborhood had weakened so much that the land itself no longer felt like a battleground. Instead, it became a quiet symbol of her failed attempts to control us, a patch of earth that no longer held the power to cause us stress. Nancy, however, wasn't done making herself a nuisance, even if her efforts were increasingly futile. One day, as we were working on our yard, we noticed her standing at the edge of the disputed property line, glaring at us with an intensity that would have been unnerving if it weren't so ridiculous. She didn't say a word, just stood there as if willing us to leave. It was almost comical, like she thought her mere presence would somehow make us pack up and move. We ignored her, of course, and eventually, she shuffled back to her house, muttering to herself. Her attempts to maintain control over her dwindling sphere of influence extended to her store as well. Desperate to attract customers, she began running sales that were so frequent they barely counted as promotions. The prices, once absurdly high, were now slashed to the point where we wondered if she was even turning a profit. Even so, most of the neighbors continued to avoid her store, preferring the longer drive to town over dealing with her antics. The irony wasn't lost on us. Nancy had fought so hard to hold on to her store and reputation, only to watch both crumble before her eyes. Sam, meanwhile, remained as much of a liability as ever. Having returned to live above the store, he brought with him a steady stream of chaos. While Nancy had initially forbidden him from throwing wild parties, it didn't take long for him to start bending the rules. The noise complaints began trickling in again, and while the police were less frequent visitors than they'd been in the past, the disruption was enough to annoy the few remaining customers. It seemed Sam hadn't learned anything from his past mistakes, and Nancy's inability to rein him in only made things worse. Despite all this, Nancy's downfall wasn't entirely satisfying. There were moments when we felt a pang of pity for her, not because she didn't deserve the consequences of her actions, but because it was clear she had no idea how to stop digging her own grave. She clung to her entitlement and bitterness like a lifeline, unable to see that her stubbornness was the root of her problems. Watching her flounder was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. Fascinating, but ultimately sad. Over time, our relationship with the rest of the neighborhood blossomed. The dramatic events with Nancy and Sam had inadvertently made us more approachable, as neighbors who had once been wary of us now saw us in a different light. We shared laughs over Nancy's absurd behavior, bonded over stories of her antics, and even gained a reputation as the patient ones who had somehow managed to survive her relentless scheming. The invisible dog fence incident became a favorite story among our friends. The image of Nancy's electric lawn mower sputtering to a halt after running over the buried wire never failed to draw laughter, especially when paired with her outraged expression as she realized she couldn't pin the blame on us. It was a small victory, but one that perfectly encapsulated her knack for turning even minor disputes into self-inflicted disasters. As the years went on, Nancy faded further into the background. Her store eventually closed, a victim of her mismanagement and tarnished reputation. Sam moved out, though no one seemed to know where he'd gone, and frankly, no one cared. The property dispute that had once consumed so much of our energy became little more than a footnote in our lives, a reminder of how far we'd come and how much we'd endured. In the end, Nancy's greatest punishment wasn't the insurance bill or the ruined lawnmower. It was her isolation. The neighborhood she once tried to control had moved on without her, leaving her to stew in her own bitterness. For us, the experience was a lesson in resilience, patience, and the power of community. We had come through the chaos stronger, wiser, and more connected to our neighbors than ever before. Life in our little corner of the world wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was more than enough.